Oh, hello. So where I left off was talking about Ostrom and Agrawal and Carl Folk as the people who've been defining this field. And so here's a paper from Agrawal, and said that this is one way to look at community-based conservation, that you can think of as community as a small area or a small number of individuals, and it's culturally and socially homogeneous, and that they, as a consequence, have a set of shared understandings about resource use, and this might lead to desirable outcomes. And that he argues that that's probably a less effective way to think about it than to think about this, is that communities can vary, and they vary by size, composition, norms of behavior, and dependence on those resources, and that individuals within those communities may vary on their dependence on those resources, and that then this is filtered through some sort of government, that there are different institutional arrangements. They also vary, and they have different processes of decision making and enforcement, and that these things together result in these resource outcomes. And if we think about these in concert, it's a much more fruitful way to think about it. I'm not going to stop here very long, so if you want to pause this and take a look at this slide, you're welcome to. This is Eleanor Ostrom, and this is a paper she wrote with Thomas Dietz a few years back. I guess it's probably out of a book, The Struggle to Govern the Commons. She had a book called Governing the Commons. But again, thinking about a set of rules that and guidelines and necessary things you have to do to be able to think about governance of a natural resource, thinking about dealing with conflict and how do you induce compliance with the rules. And you might, that clearly defining the boundaries of the resource user groups helps to deal with conflict, etc. Actually, I find this to be a little bit more of a useful table. It's out of an Agrawal paper. I think it was the same paper as I cited up above. But you can think about the resource system characteristics, that resources that enable sustainable management by a common pool of people is a small resource size with well-defined boundaries and low levels of mobility. So if you're trying to protect a forest, or, for example, the trees have no mobility whatsoever, that the possibilities of storage of benefits from that resource are high, and that that forest has well-defined boundaries. And if that community, if it's small and that a community owns that forest, then that helps. Whereas if you think about a forest being, the Amazon, then there are communities throughout that forest, and that it has less well-defined boundaries, and it's not small. Similarly, smaller groups with clearly defined boundaries, like a village territory or turf and shared norms, and successful experiences managing things in the past, social capital, trust, leadership. These are things that really help groups co-manage resource interdependence upon the groups. So these are things that are very helpful. There's also things that favor common governance, that deal with governance and institutional arrangements, that rules are simple and easy to understand, that there's enforcement, and that enforcement is easy, etc. And so these are things that vary continuously, and so it's a multivariate problem, and that should be viewed as such, and that there are things that come together that help foster good governance, but not any one thing is a guarantor of it. And so using these principles, a variety of people have been working very hard on community-based conservation, and that there are some really great examples all over the world of this actually working for the benefit of people and nature. Of course, it doesn't work everywhere, that you have these large protected areas that have many, many communities around them, and as a consequence, all have influence on what goes on in those protected areas. I want to spend just a few minutes now shifting the gears a little bit to thinking less about international means of community-based conservation, but thinking a little bit about private conservation. I don't think that I've shown this slide before. Maybe I have, but on the lower right is a graph showing where we find biological diversity in the United States, particularly with NatureServe imperiled species and listed species, and private property is a huge contributor with respect to listed species, the largest contributor. It's estimated that a third of at-risk species are found only on private properties, and so to do a full job of conservation, we really need private engagement. Over on the left is the U.S. federal budget. The big blue square pie, piece of the pie is Social Security. Red and green there are medical support. Orange over on the left is defense. Basically, that all the big slices of the pie are all the major programs that range from Social Security, healthcare, and defense. And all those teeny, weeny, weeny little wedges are things that we do in other agencies. That red arrow points to the Department of Interior, which has a tiny budget relative to the size of the federal budget. We just don't have very many resources to do the job of conservation, so we really require private participation. And that this has, let's see, this got all messed up, so let's see if I can figure out if I can move this down. Yes, all right. So that this has different forms, thinking about what to do about endangered species on private property, and certainly we've seen over the last 20 years a big change in the way the federal government deals with endangered species on private lands. But it also has manifest in a huge growth in land trusts and people investing in protected areas or protections on private lands that are basically held by small NGOs. And as I mentioned earlier, this has translated to the international scene in that in 2014, there's a huge emphasis on privately protected areas, and they are erupting all over the world. This is the state of Limpopo in South Africa. All the green areas on there, this is basically a tourism site, are all private protected reserves where you can go and look at nature in that state. So, it looks, there's parts of Kruger National Park and in that area, and there's some other wilderness areas, but there are private protected areas all over the place, and they have game lodges and reserves and huge investment in protecting nature as an industry. Conversely, flipping that around a little bit, we also have an effort to get people engaged in conceptually as well as with their lands. And so this realm of participatory research, or citizen science as it's often called, is burgeoning, and you see centers developing for participatory research all around the country in universities. This is a screenshot from Nature's Notebook, which is part of the National Phenology Network, which is a program designed to engage people in understanding the phenology of their environs. And of course, the bird surveys and butterfly surveys, there's lots and lots of these different sorts of programs now to try and engage people in learning about nature, valuing nature, and participating in a community level process of protecting that nature. And that's all about building these engaged stakeholders. And I'll end with just a slide that I showed on the first lecture early in the quarter, where I mentioned that there are these different frameworks for decision-making within conservation: strategic foresight, systematic conservation planning, structured decision-making, open standards, evidence-based practice. And they vary, among other things, in how they view the role of stakeholders in the activity. So evidence-based practice doesn't do much with stakeholders. Open standards and views stakeholders as that community of people who are all striving for the same goal of conservation, and therefore generally isn't particularly conflict-laden. You don't have people with different visions of what they want to do, whereas systematic conservation planning and structured decision-making and strategic foresight all explicitly have processes that say you should be bringing people together that have very different visions of what a successful future looks like to the table, and people who are exploiting resources in an area as well as people who are trying to protect those resources. So you can set some common guidelines and common boundaries about how you deal with that environment and better understand each other's goals and aspirations for those natural resources. And that this has been also a new, I think, and helpful advance in thinking about conserving natural resources and within a community context. And so you have things like the open standards, in this case, being adopted by something called the Conservation Coaches Network, which is a network of over 2,000 conservation coaches, and those conservation coaches are often engaged in community-based conservation around the world, where they're working with stakeholders who have a resource, who are trying to conserve that resource in some way, develop a plan, and do effectively adaptive management. Okay, with that, I'll end and